Our next speaker is Dr. Douglas Darnall, and he's going to be talking on the psychosocial treatment of parental alienation. By way of his background, he's the author of Divorce Casualties, Understanding Parental Alienation in its second edition, and also the book Beyond Divorce Casualties, Reuniting the Alienated Family. He is the PsychCare Inc. CEO and Clinical Director of the Liberty Clinic. PsychCare has 8 outpatient mental health clinics in northeastern Ohio that are accredited by the Joint Commission. Dr. Darnall received his doctoral degree from Kent State and his master's degree from San Diego State University. He's been a practicing psychologist for 32 years and previously worked 20 years for the Trumbull County Family Court. He's testified in 12 states and served over 1,000 families. He has appeared on the Montreal show and on Court TV and numerous radio shows. He's been authored and co-authored. He has authored and co-authored numerous peer-reviewed journal articles on parental alienation and spontaneous reunification. He is on the editorial board of the American Journal of Family Therapy. Reference to his work has been written up in over 50 newspaper articles. Dr. Darnall has given presentations to both state and national conferences, including the Missouri State Bar and the North Dakota State Bar Association. AFCC, Children's Rights Council, and local and state bar associations. He has gained international recognition for his work with divorced families. Doug? By the way, those of you who have not yet completed your assignment and dropped them back to me, if you could work on that, not during the talk, but during the break, please do so. Thanks.
It's a pleasure being here. You just made me sound old.
I'll make it 22 years then.
There you go. Okay. This is very exciting to me, and one of the reasons is that your attendance here says to me that there is a lot to be learned. You know, when you look at the evolution of science, science begins with observation. Richard Gardner made an observation. He defined a phenomena. We today still struggle with definitions of this phenomena. And then there's the process of trying to validate the phenomena in terms of research. And this is obviously one of the big debates when we're talking about the DSM-5. But now we're moving to the next step when we're talking about treatment. And part of the difficulty is that we do not have validated treatment protocols for parental alienation or the alienated child. We're still evolving, and I think part of your interest in being here is that you're looking for some answers, and perhaps you're looking for some affirmation about what you're already doing. And I think in time, we'll try to get research, but as you know, research with this population would be very difficult. First of all, in terms of getting adequate sample size, getting enough people to participate, defining the variables. And so for those reasons, that's why Richard and I are doing these paper studies that you're all asked to complete, because one of the things that we have identified in talking with different therapists is that the therapy for reunification is not like traditional therapy. And it also creates some ethical dilemmas, such as dealing with confidentiality and privacy and how to exchange information between child and parent. And, you know, one of the areas that has created a lot of board complaints has to do within the context of custody cases and often dealing with very angry parents. So this is the purpose of why we're asking you to complete those questionnaires, because we will publish the results. And I tend to move around a lot, so I'm kind of feeling imprisoned in here, okay? So anyway, I'm going to talk about some treatment protocols, not with the idea that I have the ultimate answers, but mostly with the intent of having you kind of look at what you're doing and perhaps seeing some additional resources that you can use in working with these families. Now, a lot of what I'm talking about has been published in my revised divorce casualties and then also the one beyond divorce casualties, and I go into far greater detail than what I'm able to do in this forum because of the time restraints. So let me move on. And the point I'm making on this slide is there has to be a better way in dealing with conflict other than jousting, which we've all seen. So let's talk about the basics in terms of reunification therapy. I have to move. Okay. There we go. First of all, we still have a lot of questions about how do you define success. If you talk to an angry parent who feels victimized by alienation, they'll tell you that success is I gain custody of my son or daughter. That's what they'll tell you. And anything short of that, they may see as failure. Well, one of the things that we learned, you know, like with my study with Barb Steinberg, is that there are a lot of different ways of defining success, but I think at minimum there has to be an interaction. Now, between the parents. For an example, Richard Gardner did a follow-up study of, I forgot how many parents, but all these parents somehow received custody they were victimized by alienation. They received custody, and he wanted to do a follow-up. So what he did is he interviewed, probably on the telephone, these parents, but he did not interview the parent who lost the custody. So the assumption there, if you look at his research, is success was only measured by a change of custody, not with the idea that the child ideally has a loving and reciprocal relationship with both parents. And that's personally my feeling, ultimately, is the goal. Reunification therapy, and again, we're still at the theory stage, but it seems to be founded on family systems theory, cognitive behavioral therapy, and attachment theory. Presently, there's no efficacy studies supporting outcome with any of these approaches. And if you go to court and you're ever asked that question, be upfront with it. This was actually my secretary's daughter, and I had her in my office, and I thought that would be a good picture. Okay. Well, she was a little actress there. Okay. I will say that success is defined by the parents and the child upon completion of the unification therapy. The success cannot be defined by the therapist. It's not our child, it's not our family. You know, obviously we have a bias in that we want to see the child to have a loving relationship with both parents, okay? But that might not be the same definition that the two parents have. I will say, though, that dropout, involuntary dropout, or I should say dropout by one of the parents, I don't define as success. Okay, what are some of the ground rules that I think we have to look at? Well, first of all, we do have to feel protective of the child. And this is very difficult in severe alienating cases where the child is stating that they're terrified of the targeted parent, they want nothing to do with them. And by the way, this is an issue that the courts struggle with too, okay? When the courts are being asked to reunify the child with an alienating parent, and the child is expressing terror and fear, that puts the court in a dilemma. because they don't want to cause or feel that they're the cause of further harm to the child. And very often, that's when they look to us as professionals to kind of make that assessment, especially when you get into allegations of abuse. I mean, one way of stopping the whole judicial process is to make an allegation of sexual abuse. Everything comes to a stop at that point. But the other ground rule, and I'm not even sure this is the right place. I have seen on numerous occasions that by the time a parent comes to me, usually requesting that I am a consultant or I become involved as an expert witness, these parents are so frustrated, so angry, that they become their own worst enemy. They very often, by the time they go to court, they're not very likable people. They don't know how to sell themselves. And it's very easy for the court to rule against a parent who is not very likable, who has tantrums. And one of the responsibilities that I've said to attorneys in these situations is the parent has to learn to control themselves. They have to be nice. And I recognize it's very difficult, but they really sabotage themselves. The other ground rule is that if you're involved with reunification, you have to avoid alliances or allowing yourself to be aligned with one parent. You have to avoid that. You cannot take, and you have to spell out the ground rules, and I'll be mentioning this shortly. You cannot take pro se conversations with either of the parents behind the other parent's back. Because an alienating parent will try to solicit you as an ally for their cause. And you have to reject and make that very clear that that is not your function. When you get involved in looking at a case that is potentially dealing with alienation, first of all, and I think Dr. Bennett made this point very clear, alienation is only one possible explanation to explain a parent-child problem. You have to look at all of the other possible alternative explanations to help explain that parent-child problem. And it's difficult because you're going to have a parent who's going to be so biased in wanting to get you aligned with them that they're very often, they're not even going to want to hear where perhaps they are a contributing factor. But let me say this. Most of the cases I've been involved with, if not all, the complaining parent was also part of the problem. It wasn't just good guy versus bad guy. And you have to be open to that. As they see in CSI, that's a good show. You follow the evidence. You follow the data. You may have hypotheses and theories as you're developing and getting data, but you have to be open to the idea that your hypothesis as to what is going on may be wrong. And to keep in mind that if you're ever called in court, you don't want to sit there and try to support a hypothesis that you later found was false, because then you're going to look and feel like an idiot. Okay? So you follow the evidence. The other thing, too, you got to comply with the existing court orders, and you should comply with well, that doesn't even fit really at that point. Okay. The other thing that is very difficult with this whole issue of alienation, because like I said, it's created new ethical dilemmas. I see, and I get calls quite frequently, where particularly counselors and social workers find themselves being pulled into a dual relationship. And it happens in a number of ways. And this can happen with psychologists too. You're working with the family, you're working with mother, you're working with the children, And maybe you're even working with the father, but then you find out that a divorce is pending. And you get a phone call from the attorney, and the attorney says, will you come and testify in court about what a wonderful woman this is, what a wonderful mother she is, or what a wonderful father she is? Will you come to court and do this? You don't want to do that. You're asking for a lot of trouble, okay? There's a difference between being an expert witness and a fact witness, okay? The fact witness, which by the way you typically do not get paid for when you're subpoenaed in court as a fact witness. All you can testify is, I know this person, I've treated this person, you might provide the diagnosis, but you cannot project future in terms of custody or visitation. If you do that, you're looking for a very serious board complaint. And boards are looking for those kind of complaints. And let me tell you, because I've been through it, most people in this profession, including myself, has had to struggle with board complaints. And I've won every one of them. But it can be extremely costly, extremely stressful, and to tell you the truth, it's a bigger risk than malpractice. And if you ever look on your insurance policy, most policies will give you like $5,000, maybe $25,000 to deal with board complaints. For minimal amount of money, you can increase it to $75,000 to $100,000. And I really suggest if you're in this kind of work, increase your coverage for board complaints. That's your biggest risk with this population, okay? So anyway, you cannot be a therapist and an evaluator concurrently. In fact, if you get in the role of an evaluator, you should have never had any historical content with those parents or with that child when you anticipate the possibility of going to court. Part of the dilemma that can get you into ethical problems is not having a statement that gets signed that has to do with informed consent. You have to spell out the ground rules beforehand in writing with parent signatures. And depending on the child, you might even involve the child, if they're a teenager, where they can understand what their role is and how they're involved, especially on the issues of confidentiality. And like I said, when you're doing collaboration, as part of your gathering the data, you need the necessary signed releases. And it was kind of interesting because Richard in the Journal of Family Therapy just asked me to review a journal article. And it was an article on an issue that I never really thought of. But it had to do with the whole issue of confidentiality in relation to you consulting with a member of a clergy or the church, especially if that particular denomination has a large lay clergy, because there basically is no confidentiality. And they're actually protected by the First Amendment, where no one can go after the clergy in terms of violating the confidentiality. They're not under the same standards that we're under. So if you're being asked to do a collaboration with a member of the clergy, you really need to spell out exactly what the risks are for the client, that you cannot protect confidentiality if that information then goes to your pastor. I never knew that, and I thought that was very interesting. The other thing, too, where people get confused as far as an ethical trap is the difference between being an objective observer or data gatherer as opposed to being an advocate. And I know that sometimes, especially when our heart goes out with these kids, we want to be real strong advocates. We can only be an advocate within the context of presenting objective data. And one of the things that I do, and I think we're going to see this more and more, especially when I'm doing an intake, and you know, part of any intake is you're assessing the family and all that, is that interviews. And of course, I do that with their knowledge. And to give you an example, this was one of my fun cases, is I had a mother who brought the 5-year-old child saying that I think, you know, daughter saying that I think father is sexually abusing the 5-year-old daughter. And one of the clues that tells you when the mother, in this case, when a parent is not trying to alienate, but may be, legitimately reacting to information that could be true, and that was she's willing to accept alternative reasons as to why the child may feel that somehow there was inappropriate sexual contact. So the mother really was pretty sharp on this. But anyway, I was interviewing the little girl, taping it. Girl knew it was taped. And during the course of the interview, the question came up, who was present when this happened? And she said, well, mother was there. My mommy was there. Well, a big red flag cropped up, and I said, you said that your mother was there. Let me ask you this. Can we invite your mother in to listen to this tape, that we did, to hear what you said? And the little girl said, absolutely. She had no problem with that at all. So mother came in and heard what the little girl said and said, you know what? It never happened. That was the end of the issue right there. Because she heard it in her own daughter's words. Okay? That's one reason why it's kind of nice to tape these interviews. But remember that, especially if you're doing evaluation, the interviews can be subpoenaed, okay, as part of your work product. So you got to be cautious of that. I transcribe my interviews, but even there we save the tapes too, because that's still data. Okay, other ethical traps, recommending withholding visitation without a court order. You can have all of these concerns. You may hear allegations of abuse. You have the ethical responsibility to report that abuse to the proper agency. They do the investigation. You don't. You're not qualified to do an investigation of sexual abuse. And one of the things that research has consistently shown is the more people that interview the child, the less credible their testimony is going to be. So when you hear those allegations and they're new, you have to report it. And by the way, when I make the reports, I typically bring in the parent so they can hear, if it's coming from the child, so they can hear the report and my talking to the Children's Service Agency. And very often I will then have the parent talk to the Children's Service Agency so they can schedule their appointments. Okay? I am not qualified. I probably know more than most on how to conduct those investigations, but that is not my role in this case or as part of reunification therapy. In Ohio, failure to report is actually a criminal offense. You can get in real big trouble by not reporting it. And I explain to the parent when I make the report that I'm obligated under law, I have no choice in the issue, and my role is not to investigate. Now, I may have personal feelings about how the agency is going to investigate, but again, I have to go by the law. And another ethical trap is to conclude that there was no abuse without supporting data. But that could be very difficult because it's very hard to prove a negative as opposed to a positive. But again, that's why you want the people who are licensed or qualified in your state to do those investigations. So, the other issue too is obviously when you're working with reunification therapy, and the approach that I take really is I want to work with the parents. I actually make the parents the primary patient that I'm working with, more so than the child, but I obviously have to have access to the child. There has to be, in writing, an agreement as part of the informed consent that there is no confidentiality between the parents and with me during my interviews, okay? Now, I get that in writing, but I have to be able to exchange information. I require keeping appointments, and I expect that if you don't show up, you're going to pay for the session. And in some cases, I've recommended to the court, and I've seen this happen, where there's questions about compliance, okay, because that's always a big issue. How are you going to get the the alienating parent to cooperate? Is to have the parents put in $1,000 or more in an escrow account and in effect, they're going to pay for the missed appointments. Okay? Unfortunately, sometimes parents have so much money they can care less, because those are usually the ones that come to me. I hate to say it, but anyway, maybe that says more about me. But I do require that they keep up with the appointments. And the other thing is, and this is often overlooked, and this troubles me, I will not typically do insurance for a couple of reasons. One is, every insurance requires a diagnosis and an identified patient. And I will tell the parent, if you're involved in litigation, do you want a diagnosis to follow you on the insurance form? Because I am not going to lie for you. So unfortunately, the only alternative is they have to pay. Sadly, this excludes a lot of people. And I don't have a solution. In fact, sometimes we get our continuing ed knowledge on the news. We don't like to admit it, but we learn a lot from the news. And I guess it was just a study that I heard the other day that over 50% of adults, both poor and middle class, could not come up with $2,000 in the next 30 days if they had to come up with $2,000. Okay? And, that's obviously a reflection on our economy. It's a reflection on savings. But then you put this in the context of high conflict divorces and all that. We haven't solved the problem, but there's a serious problem out there. And a lot of people lose cases because, frankly, often the one that has the money has the staying power. It's not fair. And, and I get many, many emails from people who have completely dried out their financial resources and have asked for my help. And to be honest with you, that's part of the reason why I wrote my books. Okay, it's cheaper to read my book than it is to sit and talk to me. I feel funny saying, go and read my book, but it really is cheaper, because a lot of what I would end up saying probably in one way or another would be in the book. But that's a real problem. But don't count on insurance paying. And by the way, I get retainers when I'm brought into the case, because I don't want to get in a situation where I'm being forced, through court order or whatever, to testify or whatever, and then I have, this whole issue that these people have these huge balances. And again, we talk about in the informed consent, the whole issue of boundaries and not going behind people's back. The protocol for reunification most typically needs to begin with a court order. Courts have different protocols. They may actually, in effect, identify a team. It could include a therapist. It can include someone to monitor the case or the progress, which could be a guardian ad litem. It could be a parent coordinator. And I really see that person as the one who reports back to the court, not the therapist. Obviously, these people can talk to the therapist in terms of compliance and maybe any progress. But really, I encourage the monitor, the GAL, to do the communication. They should also define the ground rules in the court order. And most courts don't really know how to do that very well. They just say, send them to therapy. But I need to have specifics in that court order. And very often, I will give the attorneys or the court a script, so to speak, that what could be in the court order. For an example, I was doing a custody evaluation, and the parent, who was very angry with me, filed a board complaint. And the complaint, which was at that time being supported by the board, was that part of my evaluation included their use of drugs and alcohol. The board said I had no business doing that because it was not part of the court order. Well, obviously, I refuted that, and we actually had a hearing, and what really was interesting is that the woman who made the complaint showed up at the hearing drunk. Okay? And I even had collaborative data from Children's Service Board that they had to take one of her children away because the mother was a drunk. But the board was saying, I had no business doing that because it wasn't part of the court order. It was totally absurd. And obviously that complaint went by the wayside. But it still puts you through a lot of emotional stress. So the more specific you have in the court order, and by the way, there are some states and jurisdictions that give you as a therapist or an evaluator a certain degree of immunity against board complaints or malpractice. And you really want to understand what you're protected of in your jurisdiction, okay? Because it makes a difference. You have to define the ground rules and the role of the team. And obviously, you want to establish a rapport with the family, and that begins with the judge, the role of the therapist. And again, the therapist, they'll want to manipulate you. You know, they could be the nicest people in the world, but don't count on it. Part of any therapy involves then an assessment. Now, you may already have some of these assessment things. You want to review the documents. You want to interview the parents. You want to interview the child. You want to identify obstacles of reunification, which I'll talk about in a minute. And also what I do as part of the therapy process is I identify irrefutable realities that both parents must live with. And this is the beginning of the cognitive therapy process, identifying the realities, and we'll talk about that. I try to identify distortions in their thinking, their thought process, irrational core distortions, and also identify different cognitive styles. And we'll talk about that. The other thing, too, that I try to explain to parents, and then this is true for any therapy. You know, I was brought up in California, moved to Ohio, and let me tell you, when it comes to therapy, the two cultures are very different. In California, people will get into therapy for what they call personal growth, somehow to be better at whatever it is they want to do, okay? You will never hear anybody in Ohio going to therapy for personal growth. They can care less about personal growth. They come to therapy because somehow they're feeling pain for some reason, and they want to just get rid of the pain. And typically when they're rid of the pain, they disappear. You know, we have more people who drop out of therapy because they're no longer in pain than people that go through a formal discharge. Would you say that's true for most of you? It's kind of embarrassing. We don't like to admit it, but it's true. Okay? But I think that could be okay. But then the question comes up, and this is part of the orientation. What is therapy? What are you trying to do? Okay? What is the process for change? And your clients are not going to know that. But I think it's important that in a general way they do understand that as far as the initial part of the protocol. Basically, and that's what this graph shows, people come in for whatever reason, they want to feel different about something. Okay? Feelings, whether it's depression, anxiety, anger, whatever, they want to feel different. Well, the question is, how do you change feelings? Well, we've all heard people say, don't feel that way. That doesn't help a whole lot, does it? Okay? That doesn't, I mean, if it really worked, I'd be pretty good, okay? I just say, don't feel that way, would you pay the bill on the way out, okay? And even in relationships, you know, I think sometimes people come to us where they want me to help them to feel love again. Well, if I knew how to create love, I'd have them lined up down the hall, and you know, down the street to come in and learn how to love again. I don't know how to do that either. I call that magic. But feelings are the consequence of behavior and beliefs, or how we think. Okay? And I give metaphors, I give examples of this. For an example, let's say you work for me, and I run into you in the hallway, and I say, God, I'm really glad to see you. I want you in my office at 1 o'clock today. I need to talk to you. What do most people do? They do a mental inventory of their sins. What did I do wrong now? And as a result, they feel anxiety. Now, the anxiety is very real, but is it based on reality? No. It's based on your hypothesizing as to what could happen. And I'm sure a lot of you have had anxiety over situations. You got in the situation, you found out it was no big deal. okay? Now, the good news is if we can change the thought process, then we might also be able to change the feelings, okay? Now, another thing, too, and I think it's important that we keep an open mind about how we learn and how we acquire knowledge. And one of the areas that I learned, and this has to do with feelings, is watching Dog the Bounty Hunter. Now, I know it's not cool to admit watching Dog the Bounty Hunter, but how many of you have watched Dog the Bounty Hunter? There we go. Okay. Well, it's very interesting in watching the Dog the Bounty Hunter, because he's a big, gruff, muscular guy with tattoos and long hair and all this kind of stuff. And he's a former con. And his job is to go out and get cons and people that are violating probation. And he's not intimidating. He can be pretty tough. But it's always interesting that when he gets them into the RV and they're going to jail, he starts talking to them. And all of a sudden, these people are opening up. They're crying. There's this tremendous rapport. Okay? So I was asking myself, here you got the most hardened criminals. How does he do that? Well, if you listen to the content, he really focuses in on what's important to those people, like family, and people looking up to you to take a responsibility, to care and love, and to be there. He really hooks into that, and he gets through all that resistance. And it's all based on positive emotions that we can all relate to. I thought that's fascinating. Now, another source of my education comes from the Dog Whisperer. How many of you have watched Caesar and the Dog Whisperer? Oh, God, look at this. Okay. Well, he has an interesting phenomena, too, and I wrote about these things in the book. He works with very aggressive, violent, vicious dogs, and the parents bring them in because they can't control the dog. Okay? He makes a very interesting point in turning things around, and this is what it is. He's saying that the dog is reacting to your energy, which in effect is fear, anger, frustration, and that's what they're reacting to. And if you want to change the reaction, they have to then change that energy. Now, put that in the context of high conflict divorces. Look at the parents that you're working with and ask yourself when you're dealing with them, what is the energy that they're emoting? It's anger, frustration, and doesn't it seem reasonable, without even saying a word, that the other parent could be reacting to that energy and the child could be reacting to that energy? Parents have to understand that process and work on changing that, because it's very real. We've all had occasions where we can talk to someone 2 or 3 minutes and we don't like them. I can go home, and any guy can attest to this, talk to my wife and I hear 5 words out of her mouth and I know what kind of an evening we're going to have. Okay? Am I right, guys? It's the energy, and we're trained to kind of listen for that, okay? But again, it goes back to that same kind of thing, but the energy. And that's a big part of reunification, I think, here theoretically, these two parents at least loved each other maybe for 10 minutes, maybe on a good day 15. But anyway, I assume that, short of rape, there was decent energy going on at that time, okay? And I would like to think that parent, if they kind of think about it, there were positive things that other parent did, not only as a parent, but as a couple. And sometime I would, in the therapy, let's say, let's write down the assets that this other person had, And a lot of times they say, well, actually, I'm talking about the alienating parent. They will say that the alienating parent a lot of times was a good parent in many ways. And I say, well, when's the last time you even acknowledged that to them? When's the last time you said, you know what? You're really doing a good job in helping Johnny bring up those grades. I know you're working with him. When's the last time you acknowledged that? Because again, it goes back to a change of feeling has to come with a change of behavior and a change of beliefs, okay? And for a lot of these people, it feels real strange and awkward to have to change that behavior. But that's where it has to begin. That is part of the process, okay? So, I like Dog the Bounty Hunter and stuff like that. But the treatment obstacle, the one I see quite frequently, is dealing with the persistent anger, particularly on the part of the targeted parent, but also even the alienating parent. Because like I say, this isn't an issue of good guy versus bad guy, because both sides to some degree screw up. Okay? But they have to learn, one, to control that anger, maybe reframe their thinking a little bit about their anger. They have to recognize the consequence of consistent blaming. You know, there's hardly a person that does not get defensive when somehow they're being blamed on something, whether it's rational or not. People get defensive. If I want to get you guys really upset with me, I can start coming up with all kinds of reasons to blame you. Well, and they don't have to be rational. They couldn't be rational because I don't know you. But it will make people defensive. Another treatment obstacle is that a parent has the belief that somehow they must always be in control. And this came up in one of the questions. Years ago, when I was doing court work, I developed a parental alienation scale, which is in my book. And I did MMPIs, and I had a lot of data, and I really never published it because it was during the time when they transitioned from the original MMPI to the MMPI-2. But I did find that consistently with severely alienating parents, they had a 4-6 profile, which is characteristic of a very angry individual with a lot of distrust. And it really did come out, you know, significant. And it kind of ties into this whole issue of blame, control, and we even see this, you know, in the treatment of depression. One of the characteristics of a very depressed person is the feeling they have no control, you know, of what's going on in their life, and in effect they blame others, and what they're saying is I can't feel better until you change your behavior. Well, that's totally irrational, okay, because all that's going to do is make you feel more helpless and depressed. So a lot of times they feel that they have to be right, they believe he or she is a victim, and they're unable to empathize with the other parent's perspective, including difficulty empathizing with the child and what the child could feel. And then I gave you the examples of Dog the Bounty Hunter and stuff like that. Okay, now, in my travels working with many parents, and especially parents who I define as naive alienators, which is basically every parent, because every parent, you know, innocently will say alienating things like, you know, you're acting just like your father, or you're being a bitch like your mother. Most kids can let it go in one ear and out the other. In fact, you know, you all have parents, you probably have heard these things yourself, okay? But anyway, I forgot what I was going to say. Well, we'll go on because it'll hit me, but I lost my point. Okay, but anyway, these are I know what I was saying. But anyway, what I find is that with the mild and what I call the active alienating parent, very often when they can reframe their thinking, even through kind of an educational format, they can change their behavior, okay? Because they do have a degree of self-control, but often what they lack is self-awareness, okay? And one of the differences that I find in working with moderate alienating families is I tend to be pretty directive, you know, with instruction and with education, and basically saying, if you keep doing this, this is going to be the consequence. So logic says, why don't you just not do that? Okay? A good example, and again, as I'm interviewing the people, I'm looking for these obstacles that interfere with reunification, treatment obstacles. One is espousal issues. Okay, now what is that? An espousal issue is very often the issues that caused the divorce. It was who was screwing who, you know, who is having the affairs, who is taking the money, things that really are none of the child's business. That's an espousal issue. A parental issue, which can involve the children, is how do we improve his or her grades? Where are we going to get, you know, can we get braces for the child? Do we have time in terms of how do we get the child to soccer, you know, after school and given work schedules and things like that? These are parenting issues. These are issues that are there even when they were married, okay? Children can be exposed and be part of the parenting issues. But one of the things as you're listening is you listen for espousal issues. And the parents will tell you the espousal issues. And then you really have to educate them, say, you know what, even though you have strong feelings and you may have good reason for your feelings, these are none of your child's business. They should not be exposed to espousal issues. Simple as that. And as we progress, I will identify and say, you know what, that's an espousal issue. Hopefully you're not sharing that with your child. Okay? That's another obstacle. Blaming, again, and I already talked about that. That's an obstacle because it creates a sense of powerlessness for the person who is doing the blaming. And that generates anger because the belief is, I am really angry because I think you're a lousy parent, and I'm not going to not feel angry until you change your behavior. Well, that could be very irrational because that other parent's not going to necessarily change their behavior. And this is also a question that came up. When I was doing the analysis of my parental alienation scale and the MMPI and some of the other instruments, a common trait, and by the way, these were not all alienating parents, but they were high conflict because they were ordered to see me by the court. A common trait, particularly on the part of the custodial parent, was they were very critical of the parenting skills of the other parent. Very, very critical of that. And that was reflected in one of the questions that went to Dr. Bennett. One of the realities, and we're going to talk about realities, in most jurisdictions is the court doesn't care what a parent does with that child, as long as its basic needs are attended, it's legal and consistent with court orders, and that's the reality. Courts will assign custody to a person, from our perspective, may be a lousy parent. And a lot of times, you know, I've seen where a parent will come in and say, I want to change the custody, I'm not getting cooperation, and I really think that the other parent is a lousy parent. Okay? Well, a change of custody in that circumstances is extremely rare, if not impossible. It is true that on an initial divorce filing, theoretically, mother and father are on equal footing. We know statistically, in terms of outcome, that is not true. But when you go for a change of custody, when it already exists and assigned to a parent, that is not the criteria the court uses, even though they will say we're doing it based on the best interest of the child. The criteria the court looks at now is basically, why should I upset the apple cart and upset the child unless you can show through a preponderance of the evidence that that child staying with that parent somehow is going to be damaging? And that's a very different criteria. But it's one, frankly, that's what, I mean, courts always say best interest, but that's really what the issue is. They're not going to take a risk of upsetting the child, especially if the parent can show, the one who has the custody, the child is doing well socially, they're doing well in school, they're involved in different activities, there's no neglect. They're not going to get a change of custody. I'm not an attorney, but I just don't see that happening under those conditions. But a lot of parents will come in with the belief that I am a better parent, therefore I should have custody. Don't count on it. Talk to the attorney. Other issues in terms of treatment issues is boundaries. Now, here's where this becomes important. Again, it becomes educational. With a separation and with a divorce, the rules change. And one of the rules that changes has to do with boundaries. And this can create a lot of hurtful feelings. For an example, you have father who's coming in to pick up the child. And there's no real problem, but father has the opinion or the thought, you know what, I'm thirsty. I'm going to go into the kitchen and get out of the refrigerator, I'm going to get a can of Coke. Well, now we have a problem. Now his argument is, well, it's my house, I'm still paying the mortgage on it, why can't I go in and get a Coke? But what he's done is he's violated the boundary that the mother has, rightfully so. It's not the same rule. And sometimes the two parents, first of all, they're not aware of these boundary issues, but sometimes this change of the boundaries doesn't change at the same rate for the mother as it does for the father, okay? Now, we have boundaries even when we're married, okay? I mean, I'm not going to go through my wife's wallet, okay? I just don't feel like that's my place, okay? She never told me not to, but it just doesn't feel right. It's a boundary. I define a boundary as a psychological break, B-R-E-A-K, in this example. If I approach a woman and decide to take my hand to touch her breast, I better feel a break that comes well before contact, right? That's a boundary. The good thing is, I have that memorized. I don't need to try it out every day to see if it works, okay? I've learned those boundaries. But it's an example of where the boundaries can change, and sometimes the parent couple can give very mixed messages. How many of you had a situation where you had a couple that were divorced or separated, and then you found out they had sex? You see that? Now that seems totally irrational. You think, how can that happen? Because what it does is it blurs the whole issue of boundaries. And one of the things I've learned is, and I don't want to sound sexist, but I probably am, sex very often has a different meaning for men as opposed to women. Yeah, okay? Women tend to have sex with a relationship. Men tend to have sex with the body, okay? And because of that, it can create a lot of misunderstandings. So for an example, if a woman succumbs to sex with a separation, she may interpret that, hey, maybe things are okay with my husband, where he's just thinking, hey, I'm not horny today. Okay, entirely different meaning. So couples is part of, when you're listening for your couples during the reunification process, listen for boundary violations and look for them, okay? Another issue, obviously, is mental disorders and personality disorders. And when we really see that in reunification, the mental disorder and all that should be treated in a different form outside of reunification therapy. Because again, that's going to create all kinds of ethical problems and confusion in terms of roles. Same thing with substance abuse. And then the other thing you're looking at too and trying to assess, and this is what Dr. Bennett talked about, is that some children literally develop a phobic reaction towards a parent, okay? Which could be in the form of separation anxiety. And it could be totally irrational, but by definition, phobias are irrational. I just put this in. Think before jumping. We were in one of the islands. This is one of these cliff jumpers. Okay, and I thought, well, that sounds pretty good. I didn't do that. Okay, now let's talk about some of the other boundary issues. Because again, you're gathering this data during your interviews. And these are pretty easy issues to identify and to address. One of them is theorizing, okay? Now, human beings, by our very nature, are nosy. And what we don't know, we make up. Okay? And what's really confusing is if we have any emotional reaction to what we make up, therefore we conclude it must be true. It goes back to the example about the boss calling the person in saying, I want to see you at 1 o'clock. Okay? Parents involved in reunification, theorizing or hypothesizing is a very common phenomenon. And, examples, my husband abused me, it's only a matter of time he's going to abuse the kids. Okay? Now, I can't say that will happen or not happen. Actually, data says that most often it doesn't happen, but it can happen. Okay, but that's a theory. And if you have that theory and you really believe it, obviously you're going to be very protective of your child. I mean, that's understandable, but it's still a theory. You don't know that. And as a therapist, you're going to hear these things, and you have to delineate, is this person really hypothesizing and theorizing, or are they talking about reality? These are common expressions. I know what you're thinking. Okay? I know you're going to do this to destroy me. You ever hear that one? You abuse me, I know you in time you will abuse my daughter, and you will always be a drunk. That could be true too, but anyway, those are examples of theorizing. And again, your goal is to help them to recognize that that's what you're doing, and these are the traps you're going to fall into. You're going to emotionally react to these theories as if they were true, and it can cause you to behave inappropriately. Now, what is the solution to that? Check your theory out by asking a question to the person you're theorizing. You may or may not get an honest answer, but at least the process of asking the question will cause you to pause and think about what's going on. Okay, symbolic communication. This is very interesting, and it has to do not only with alienation, it has to do with any relationship, okay? When you're dating somebody, you're learning about their symbols. Now, what is a symbol? A symbol is any activity or object that takes on an emotional response beyond its face value. Okay? For example, this is one of my favorite. One of you women are my wife. Kathy, you're my wife. And I was thinking about you, driving over, about how much I love you. And I was thinking I was going to go into the florist and to buy you a rose. But then I got thinking about it. Why don't I just give you the $2? I get the ring back. Okay. That's a symbol. That rose is a symbol. Has more value, even though the $2 has more intrinsic value, but it's a symbol. And one of the things, see, you couples are looking at each other when you're talking. One of the things that happens is that one of the ways you know you're dealing with a symbol is if the emotional reaction to whatever it is way out of proportion. And you hear that in a lot of arguments, you know, like, this is absolutely crazy. It makes absolutely no sense. Typically, what you're dealing with is something symbolic to that person. Now, here's what's important about symbols. One, they can be irrational. Okay? Two, they evoke powerful emotions. Three, they're resistant to change. You're not going to talk a person out of their symbols. You might have to negotiate, but you're not going to talk them out of it. And there are gender differences. Okay? But we're starting to see some trends because now, actually, men sometimes are starting to receive flowers too. Okay, that's a change, okay, because historically it meant absolutely nothing, okay? And that when you have a conflict in symbols, you have to negotiate. And one of the ways you know that you're dealing with symbols, again, is a very strong emotional reaction, and then the other person saying, but you shouldn't feel that way. The answer to that is probably right, might be totally irrational, but that's the way I feel. Okay? That can cause issues in reunification. Realities. Now, this is the other thing I'm always listening for during the assessment part of the therapy. First of all, there are realities that neither parent can change. The difficulty is they have to negotiate around these realities in a way to not hurt the children. State laws. Now, state laws are pretty consistent, basically advocating that a child should have a loving relationship with both parents. In fact, some states will define best interest as a parent who is facilitating and encouraging a loving relationship between both parents. And by the way, not all states have definitions of best interest. Some states literally allow the judge to define it for themselves, okay? Massachusetts is one of them. I don't think they actually have a statute that defines best interest. But anyway, there goes the thought again. Anyway, the state, oh, I know what I was going to say. Converse to encouraging a loving relationship, obviously, is parental alienation. That's where it is relevant within the context of the court and in the context of custody, okay? The other reality is that children are hurt by protracted litigation. Now, I have in my office notebooks of journal articles that I've accumulated dealing with children adjustment to divorce. And like I had said, there's a lot of studies talking about the impact of high conflict on divorce, but you don't see the word parental alienation in these studies. So I am having to make a leap from high conflict to parental alienation. And to be honest with you, symbolically, and I think this was alluded to earlier, parental alienation has taken on a connotation, a symbolic connotation among some people. And one of the symbolic connotations is that it's a mechanism to be used against women. Okay? My way around that, even in the court, is let's talk about a pattern of behavior that we have learned through gathering the data. That's the issue. Not the label, but the pattern of behavior. Labels have a value because you can consolidate a lot of information within a label. Okay? And a label helps you in terms of doing research as opposed to all of the behaviors that we define under parental alienation. But it has taken on an adverse symbolic meaning to a lot of people. When you get into that, say, you know what, let's put the label aside, let's talk about the pattern of behavior. And I have a lot of research that shows children exposed to high conflict, it's damaging. It hurts children. That's a reality you got to deal with. That's a reality you have to negotiate. Other realities. Neither parent will quit. Now, sometimes an alienating parent will hope that the other parent will quit. But very often, they won't. And today, they're not quitting. So if we have court orders, children hurt by protracted litigation, I can show you research to support that. Neither parent will quit. And the other thing is, too, both parents do have something that they can offer the child. Maybe different, but that's true even when couples are together, you know. My wife does a lot better job talking about purses and recipes than I do, okay? She does that real well. I don't. I get bored. Court orders is another reality. You're not going to change that unless you go back to court. But that's a reality you have to deal with. And also, children don't ask for the hostilities. Now, during your interviewing and listening, you're going to hear different realities. And I list those things because some of them are unique, okay? And then I summarize all that and say, okay, parents, you may not like these realities, but we can't change them. And if we don't change our thinking about how to address these realities, you can feel very confident that we're going to continue to hurt the children. And I know in your heart that's the last thing you want to do. I know, see, now I'm kind of going into the mode of, what's his name? Well, you're being technical. I'm talking about Dog the Bounty Hunter. So, but I'm going into Dog the Bounty. I'm a very basic kind of guy. And the idea that, you know, you really love your children, you'll do anything you can for them, you know, and all that. And that's the last thing you want to do is to hurt the children. And the only way we cannot do that is we got to reconcile how all this is going to work. And we're going to have to think about changing our behavior. And, you know, as you're going along, you'll see where they're going to come up with these obstacles. Just because you talk about them, identify, doesn't make them go away. But you always have to go back to that context. Okay? Now, and again, stop harming the children by reconciling the realities. Okay, now we're getting into some irrational core beliefs that, and really, I'm just going to kind of present them because the process on how to deal with them in therapy would be an all-day workshop. But these are some of the irrational core beliefs. One is, I must always be a good parent. The problem is the word is always, okay? That's irrational. We strive to be a good parent. Sometimes we're better at it than other times. Sometimes we want to kill the little bastards, but we know we can't do that, okay? And we can't say that we're a good parent in that moment, okay? But we trust we'll get through that and kind of go on, okay? But some parents, as you're listening to their talking and you hear words like should and must and always, these are irrational beliefs. The other irrational belief that you'll hear, and I've heard people say, mother always knows best. Now, the fact of the matter is, the male role in the last 20 years, I think, has been changing, okay? And I think most women say to the degree it's positive, though they're not done yet in terms of changing. For an example, I think more men are getting involved with housekeeping, okay? Now, I kind of have fun with that scenario too, because women will say, I want more equality. I want my husband to share in the household responsibilities. Very logical, right? Hard to argue. But there's a difference. The woman wants to be the director of quality assurance. That is not equality. Do it my way, absolutely. And men don't do that very well. Men tend to be avoiders. So if they, are getting this message that, they're being controlled, then they tend to avoid. Okay, I'm not saying it's right, but they tend to do that. But there's another difference too. Most women, when they say something needs to be done, the garbage needs to be taken out or the dishes need to be empty, what they're also saying is it needs to be done now. That's not the way guys think. They think in terms of when I'm in the area. Yeah, when I'm in the area, if you remind me. Okay? There are differences, and you can have a little bit of fun with it, But again, it kind of goes back to this idea that mother knows best, and men, including myself, I'm not totally caught up on the notion of equality. I mean, my wife has said more than once that my favorite pastime is sitting on my ass watching TV, And then I say to her, well, tell me what you want. And then she says, I'll do it myself. Does that sound familiar? Well, okay. Would you mind giving me the remote? Okay. And the other one is, I always know what's best for the children, okay? Again, I don't want to sound sexist, but this most of the time comes from the mother, but it can also come from the father too. And again, it goes back to the idea that both parents can contribute. And sometimes we need to literally sit down and even put on paper, what are the things in the past that this parent has contributed? Now, it is true, again, we have a very unfair sexist society in many ways, okay? You go to a mall, the child's having a temper tantrum. Who do you blame? Not father, if he's standing there. You're going to blame mother. You're going to expect mother to put the child under control. Father's sitting there doing whatever he's doing. That's not equality. That's not fairness, okay? But these things still exist today, okay? And then the other issue is I'm entitled to custody for whatever reason, okay? That may or may not be true, and I'm sure you've had a lot of parents come in saying, I know I'm the better parent, I should have the custody, and then the court does not agree with that because they're using a different criteria. Common errors in thinking. And again, this goes back to the educational format. One of the common errors is just misinformation. Like what I was talking about before about the whole notion of change of custody. Now, another one that crops up a lot in the States, I can't speak for Canada, because I don't know. Years ago, states, including Ohio, had a concept of age of election, which simply meant that at the age of 14, the child can choose where they want to live. A lot of parents still believe that exists. Most states, I think all of them, have eliminated that concept. For a good reason. It puts the child in a position to publicly reject a parent, and that's never good for a child. What they have said is that a child has a right to express a preference to the court, usually through a GAL or somebody, but in effect, the child does not make that decision. Well, to this day, I still talk to parents who have that misinformation. My job, even though I'm not an attorney, and I always say that, is to give them the right information. And then I say, if need be, talk to your attorney about it. Attorneys, I think sometimes, some of them do a very poor job in educating their clients about the judicial process. Overgeneralizing. Again, the example had to do where, you know, my husband pushed me down, and it's only a matter of time that he's going to push our child down. And again, kind of overgeneralizing. And people have to understand that that's, well, they're overgeneralizing and hypothesizing. Emotional reasoning. Very common, we all do this. It's sort of like, if I have this certain feeling, therefore it must be right. And good examples of that is to talk to people about politics. We were doing this last night. We were having a wonderful conversation about politics, okay? And it generates different feelings, and it's kind of fun and stuff like that. But, you know, you could argue, well, because I feel this way, therefore it must be the truth, you know? Because Canada has nationwide health insurance, and everybody, you know, there's those who vehemently love it, therefore it must be great. Actually, I learned a lot about how Canadians look at the United States last night. I thought that was very interesting. I mean, you really look at us as really kind of a very irrational group of people. And the sad thing is, I couldn't come to our defense. So anyway, again, going back to the idea of rejecting the positive. Remember when I told you before, let's talk about the positive things this parent did in terms of parenting and positive stuff with the kids. You know, the alienating parent wants to reject all that like it never existed, okay? That's a flaw in thinking, okay? Catastrophic in thinking, I think you know a lot about that. Negative pathogenesis. This is an interesting concept. Years ago, there was a study, and I couldn't even tell you who it was because first of all, I'm lousy with names. But anyway, they wanted to look at what was the difference between good functioning families, good functioning relationships, and impaired relationships. Very basic question. So they went into the houses and they had observers and they were tallying different behaviors. And they really came up with something that I'm sure for all the money that was spent, you already knew, and that is people like to be with people that make them feel good. Okay? What that says is that the strength of a relationship and the bond has to do with the proportion of positive interaction between the two people. And what they found is that positive pathogenesis, what they're talking about, is that the interaction is about 70% positive as opposed to 30% negative. In impaired relationships, it's about 70% negative and 30% positive. So one of the questions that often I ask in dealing with high conflict is I kind of talk about this pathogenesis, and I'll say to them, what proportion of time, and you don't even have to answer the question, but what proportion of time do you spend with, in a marriage couple, the spouse, or with the children, where you're saying positive things to them? And you'd be surprised how they would come up with very low figures. And I say, well, the good news is that that's something you have control over, in terms of being able to consciously look for the more positive things and to share that, because that's where relationships come from. You want your child to take on your values. They're going to do that because you have a way of enhancing their value and their self-esteem. If you can't do that, you become aversive and you lose control and power of the child. This is something you have control over in terms of the pathogenesis. Now, sometimes they'll say, well, what do you do when our child really has a number of bad behaviors? You can't just ignore them. Well, I have a couple of responses to that. One is, when you have a newborn baby, parents, both mothers and fathers, have an innate ability to develop treatment plans. Okay, now what do I mean by that? Well, you know, first of all, developmentally what you can and cannot expect from that child. You know that they're going to have to learn to crawl before they walk. So you baby-proof the house. When they start to walk or stand up, what do? You praise them for that. You applaud. If a child gets up and let's say falls down, you don't smack them on the ass and punish them. Okay? You don't do that. But often we'll do that with our latency 8 kids, if you use that same metaphor. The other thing too, with being a treatment planner, and again, I communicate this with both parents because it does tie in the whole issue of bonding, which is another explanation for high, parent-child problems, is what are the most obnoxious behaviors we can focus on now, and what can we, for the time being, ignore? So we're not all negative. And again, ideally, the parents kind of work on that. So that's what I mean by pathogenesis, and I think it's a very powerful concept during the reunification process. In kids with severe anxiety, and I don't have a whole lot of time, because what time am I?
We're about run out, so
Okay, well, then hopefully I have a lot of questions, because I'm only about halfway through the slides. We'll make the slides available through the internet, whether it'll be through Joe's site or my site, parentalalienation.com. I think I can put that as an attachment. And a lot of what I'm talking about, oh, God, my back, are in these 2 books, and you can get them on Amazon. Beyond Divorce Casualties is a treatment book, and this one is deals with a whole lot of other issues, including how to deal with the court. So, like I expected, we only got halfway through that. But hopefully, it gives you some thought in terms of how to approach these people. And don't feel apologetic if sometimes you get in a situation where you're not sure what you're doing, because you're dealing with some of the toughest people that you could ever expect. In terms of reunification, don't ever take more than 2 clients. They will drive you nuts, they will drain you, and you just have to control that. So, okay, well, thank you. And